And that was it. I mean, that's just really it, and that's what Senator Allen reminded us all of today, so it's just critical. So why don't we go ahead and have our panelists come up, and I'm going to introduce our moderators, and our moderators will be coming up as well. Sequential Intercept 1, and I know Nastasia talked a little bit about the brochure that's in your green folder. Hang on to those. They're like gold to get. That black trifold brochure is everything you need to know about Sequential Intercept. You can change the world with that brochure. So hang on to that. It's really important, and it talks about linkages to treatment and statewide plans to change your systems statewide. So thank you for taking care of those brochures and using them, sharing the information in those with your folks that you'll be interacting with in this journey as you go along with us. So we have two amazing moderators that I'm just thrilled to have. Bea Thayer from Health Choice Integrated Care, who is the Criminal Justice Coordinator, and Brett Matosian from Hope Lives, who is their Justice Liaison. And I don't think they've got anything on us anywhere. I think these are the two best moderators we could have found in the state of Arizona. I'm really sincere in saying that. So Bea Thayer is the Justice System Liaison for Health Choice Integrated Care. In this capacity, she coordinates systems programming to bridge the gap of behavioral health services and the criminal justice among multiple disciplines. Bea's career has given her the opportunity to work with the diverse communities of northern Arizona in over 6 counties, including the Western Navajo Nation. Her coordination between multiple disciplines and agencies addresses the numerous behavioral health and systemic issues. So thank you, Bea, for being here and sharing your expertise. And Brett Matosian. Brett was gave us a great bio that shared from his heart, so I appreciated that. Brett, your openness and writing this bio for us, and I want to bring it to everyone's attention in case they haven't seen it. But and what he wrote for us is, after being arrested for the first time in his life, Brett Matosian spent 16 months in a Maricopa County jail and an additional 2.5 years in the Arizona Department of Corrections. When released in September 2013, he experienced firsthand the challenges one faces when re-entering society after a period of incarceration. He is currently the Justice Liaison for the forensic peer-run Hope Lives. And I just want to say that we all kind of take Brett for granted. So we hope you can hold up, Brett, because I know Hope Lives has you kind of going everywhere in the state. I think you've been in I don't know how many prisons. I don't know if you could remember how many you've been in, but we are just very grateful to have you here today to moderate for us. So, and I'm going to let you introduce the panelists, and you all can come over here and grab your mics. I know, Bea, you wanted the other mic, so we got that one. Thanks.
While she's getting suited up, I think I'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for all showing up today. As Senator Allen had mentioned, having us all in the room, just showing up is part of the thing that we've been tasked with. Having the heart to make a difference and to do the work that's necessary. And at the end of the day, there's really no easy way to do it. It's just hard work and requires heart and requires commitment. So we've heard a lot this morning about stepping up, and we've heard about how it's based that it's important that the counties take into consideration the 6 questions that they need to ask of each other, of themselves, when they decide to get involved with the Stepping Up initiative. And I think Nastasia Walsh did a great job of going over that with everyone, and then to hear the comments that Senator Allen brought to the table kind of gave it a personal feel to it, because that's the thing at the end of the day that we have to remember, that we're dealing with individuals' lives. And when we look at the Stepping Up initiative, the 4 goals that we're tasked with approaching, which were laid out on the PowerPoint, which I appreciated, were reducing the number of people in our jails with mental illness, shortening their length of stay, reducing recidivism, and who can help me with the 4th one? What was the 3rd one? Awesome. Increasing connections to treatment. So, and those are the things that we really want to take a look at. So when we look at the Stepping Up initiative and we look at the 6 questions that we ask ourselves as counties, we also want to understand that part of the Stepping Up initiative is based on the Sequential Intercept model. It's one of the foundational premises for the initiative. For those of you who have the handout in your green packets, over the next 2 days, we're going to be covering the first 3 intercepts. We're not going to necessarily take a look at intercept 0, but we're going to be taking a look at intercepts 1, 2, and 3. Today, we're going to be looking at intercept 1, and the panelists that we have on the stage today will be talking to those issues. And one of the things that I think we'd like you to keep in mind, that regardless of what work you're doing along the model and in the Stepping Up initiative, everyone shares the same objective, and that objective is to divert people away from the criminal justice system and into proper supportive care where they can receive the help that they need. So with that said, I am going to pass the mic over to Bea and let her introduce our panel.
Turn it on. Are we here? I feel like I'm supposed to be on Sing or something when I hold up the mic. Okay, so of course, none of this could happen without some great collaboration, partnerships, stakeholders, all of that getting together, people sitting down, finding out what others need, the folks who are in the weeds, the ones who are the boots on the ground, the people who do the work. And so let's have some fun. We have a great panel of the folks who get to do the work. First right here is Miss April Rhodes. April is the CEO of Spectrum Healthcare Group, which is the behavioral health home contracted with the Northern Arizona REBA. And so it covers eastern Yavapai County. And then sitting next to her is Dr. Margie Belfour, who's Vice President over at Clinical Innovation and Quality at Connections AZ, which is one of the largest providers of crisis services in our state. We have Jason Linsky, who is with Tucson Police Department. He gets to talk about some wonderful partnerships going on with the community in identifying individuals with mental illness and substance use and needs assistance. One of my great friends, Dr. Runge with Flagstaff Police Department, and co-chair with a behavioral health subcommittee out of Coconino County's Criminal Justice Coordinating Council. And then we have Ms. Michelle Swan with CBI, and talk about also the behavioral health side when working in the intercept with emergency, crisis, law enforcement intercepts. So in your packet are some in-depth descriptions of their bios that I'll let you guys get into. So with that, we will start with our first question, and it goes out to April. Spectrum Healthcare Group, which does provide the full range of behavioral health services for Medicaid-eligible individuals as contracted through the REBA and through the Access system. Although crisis services are open up to anyone regardless of the funding, providing that immediate mobile response to any location within your communities when called upon by law enforcement, and done so in a timely manner, which I believe you're averaging about 30 minutes, is not a contractual obligation. Through your leadership, Spectrum took this challenge on and has been successful. could you tell us what this looks like in eastern Yavapai County and how leadership, if you remember leadership was number one on our questions, is not only leadership not only within Spectrum, but among the various law enforcement agencies has played a significant role?
I will, Bea. But first, I wanted to see if you all noticed that Brett seems to have a fan club here, because there was a lot of loud remarks back there, but I think Bea as well has a fan club, so I'm not sure where they were at, but if we could get that. I just wanted to make sure everybody knew her fan club was here as well. So thank you, Bea. Thanks for those kind words. So yes, I think it's important when we talk about leadership commitment and when we talk about it specifically as it relates to these 6 questions in the report that was outlined this morning, that we need to set a conceptual framework for what that means exactly and what exactly we were asking leadership to commit to. And so in order to do that, I'm going to take you back just a little bit to my early days as a CEO, which was 2 years ago. But when I first embarked on this road, I didn't know anything about sequential intercept models or the Stepping Up initiative or anything like that. And really, the way that this came onto my radar was about 2 months into my CEO tenure. I got a call from Bea, ironically. We've been doing this for a while now. And she told me about a client that was just arrested in Yavapai County, a member of Spectrum, and taken to jail, and probably because we didn't have a mobile crisis response. And in fact, the law enforcement that had responded to this individual had tried to get Spectrum to come out and talk with them instead of taking them to jail. And both times that they called, we informed them that we would meet them at the emergency department. And so in Yavapai County, it's important to know that the emergency department in this case was about 25 minutes further than the county jail. And so as you can imagine, it wasn't just an easier response to take them to jail. It actually became necessary at a certain point in that call. And so when she's telling me that 2 months in, I was thinking, well, that's an anomaly, of course. Of course Spectrum staff will respond in real time to law enforcement. And I said, how could that be? How could that have happened? And Bea said, well, April, that's what always happens. That's what Spectrum does. They ask people to go to the emergency department and meet them there. And so I was outraged, really, and thought, well, that can't happen anymore. That's not going to happen. And as all of us do, and we're in our early days of leadership, I thought, I'm going to go back and I'm just going to fix this problem. And I'm going to get a mobile crisis response team to go out. It'll be really easy. And my chief clinical officer happens to be in the room, Carrie, and so she probably remembers the day that I came back and I said, can you guys believe that this happened? And she said, well, yeah, April, we send everybody to the emergency department because we don't have the resources to cover the 8,100 square miles, or a third of that really, that exist in Yavapai County. And so just, to give you that conceptual framework when it comes to the challenges we were encountering as leadership, Yavapai County covers 8,100 square miles. And to give that context, Maricopa County is only about 1,000 square miles larger than Yavapai County. And we cover about a third of that in eastern Yavapai County. But in that area, there's about 6 little townships and little cities, and they all think of themselves as very unique. And there are 8 agencies policing those 6 little townships. And so it wasn't so simple as, hey, let's make a mobile crisis team, and then we're going to respond to all these agencies. And so when I went back to my leadership team and said, I want you guys to figure out how to respond to every single corner of our geographic service area, which covers all of these little townships. I want you to do that in 30 minutes or less. I want a 24/7 response, and it needs to be useful and effective. No big deal, right? And that's, kind of a heavy lift, and they all looked at me like, that's going to be really difficult. But I asked them, I asked them all for a level 5 commitment to that kind of response, and my Spectrum leadership team will tell you that a level 5 commitment for us means that we are committing that no matter what, we will do whatever it takes, including not stopping, to make that happen. And so when I had that kind of commitment internally at the Spectrum leadership table, then it was time to take it externally to the county. And so this is an important part in the narrative to note 3 very specific components that I think were integral in our success at this first question that you ask yourselves. And that was the immediate and very strong support that we had from Yavapai County Sheriff's Office, and specifically Sheriff Scott Masher, Chief Deputy David Rhodes, who happens to also be my husband,
But at the time he wasn't. He was the jail commander. And with the two of them really encouraging and strongly supporting this project, they were able to, I think, give a lot of credibility and get all of those other 7 law enforcement agencies to the table to talk about this. And, we really came to a common, shared ground around the frustration we were all experiencing, as many of you law enforcement in the room will identify with, when you respond to somebody in the field and you know that they don't need to go to jail, but you don't have another alternative. And so the second piece that was critically important that we were lucky in our county with, and it was kind of an unsuspected level of support from a newly arrived partner on the scene, and that was the leadership at Crisis Response Network, and specifically Sarah Skoll, who I don't know if she's here or not, but Crisis Response Network at that time had just gotten the contract to provide crisis hotline services for all of northern Arizona. And she approached me pretty early on and said, we want to be a part of making this happen. We want to help you do that. And without that level of support, Spectrum, on top of establishing a mobile crisis response team, would have also had to establish a hotline, a 24-hour availability of call center employees for law enforcement to call and access these types of services. So from that point on, it really became Sarah and I, kind of leading the charge on this. And the third critical component is that we had very strong commitment and support from leadership at the Regional Behavioral Health Authority and Health Choice Integrated Care, and specifically Bea Thayer, who anybody who's worked with Bea knows that she will do whatever it takes, including not stopping, to get all of these people on both sides at the table every single time, and she did exactly that. And so I think that covers kind of the leadership commitment on a verbal level. We all agree this is a problem. We all agree we need to do something about this. We're all frustrated. But I think what's important to note in our success as well is that Sarah and I didn't go back to our respective companies and say, we're going to craft a program, we're going to come back, we're going to shove it at law enforcement and say, this is what you're going to do and this is how you're going to access our services. Rather, we came to the table as a group, all 8 law enforcement agencies, Health Choice Integrated Care, Spectrum Healthcare Group, and Crisis Response Network, and said to law enforcement, how could this work for you? If there was an alternative for you, rather than taking people to jail, what would that look like, and how could we craft that in a way that would be accessible and easy for you to use? And all of them provided feedback and input and support into crafting the program and what it would look like. And several themes emerged throughout that, and that was that it needed to be a timely response, obviously, and that we needed to come. I mean, that would be ideal. Like, if they couldn't rely on the program, it probably wouldn't work. And they wanted that to be to everywhere that they were at. They didn't want to have to think about, well, where am I and who do I call and what kind of services do I access? So with that in mind, we went back and created a program that they helped to structure. And so I think that was an important part as well at this planning level. But another thing, this really, sometimes I go on and it seems like I don't have a point, but I promise you I will get to a point. And so the other thing that I think was important was that Sarah and I went out personally to every single one of these law enforcement agencies. And remember, we cover about a third of the county, of that 8,100 square miles. There are 6 townships. I can't stress that enough. 6 townships, 6 little cities, 8 law enforcement agencies. All of them have different schedules. All of them have different processes. All of them have different ways of doing things. And we went to every single one of those and trained personally, Sarah and I, all of their officers. So we were at roll calls, we were at shift changes, we were there early in the morning, late at night, the middle of the day, whatever it took to train as many officers as we possibly could on how we wanted this process to look. And on top of that, we took it a step further, and Sarah and I handed out our cell phone numbers on business cards and said, if you try to activate this service in the middle of the night and you encounter anything different than what we've outlined for you here, we want you to call us in the middle of the night, and we will help you work through that. And we took those calls. Sarah, if she were here, if she is here, will tell you, we got calls in the middle of the night. My chief clinical officer will tell you, we got calls in the middle of the night. I took those calls, and I think when you're trying to make something like this work in the early days that we were in, I think that speaks volumes in demonstrating the level of commitment that we had as leadership to making this happen. And when officers called and we answered the phone and solved their problem, I think that helped as well. And so The other thing that I think was important is that we held regular meetings and we set out, I think this is a good time to note too, that when we started this 18 months ago, we set out to do about a 90-day pilot project to just law enforcement. That's all we were going to do. We got everybody at the table to commit that no matter what, we would stick to this process for 90 days. Even if it wasn't working, even if there were problems, we were going to stick it out for 90 days. And everybody did that, all these law enforcement agencies. And we met monthly to talk about how it was working, what the issues were, and what things we needed to work on. And I think that that was critical to the success as well. And I know we're going to get into tracking progress later. But still to this day, we hold those meetings. We hold them quarterly now. And still to this day, 18 months later, every single one of those law enforcement agencies still shows up. I'm still leading those meetings. And there isn't a time that I sit at those tables and look around the table at every law enforcement agency represented, and I think that's remarkable that we had the leadership of these agencies at the table, and don't realize or don't think to myself or marvel in the fact that this is a really special collaboration that we've got going in Yavapai County, and that it's really having an impact. And as you heard Sheriff Masher say earlier, we've answered 481 calls and arrested 7. So even in our small corner of the world in Cottonwood, we're making that large of a difference. But it all started with the countywide leadership commitment that I described early on. And so I think it can't be overstated, the importance of that leadership commitment early on in the process. And I hope that answered your question. I told you I had a point. I came.
I think it was great, April, and I think it was great to know, too, that even your staff who's down in the weeds, when they know that their leadership is committed and that, Carrie, the chief clinical officer, everybody's committed, that we're going to work through the bumps and we're going to find it. And thank you. That's great.
I think, April, and one of the things that I'll add that is really important is that we understand not all counties have access to the same resources. And so April pointed out a great illustration of how they brought together the key stakeholders that were necessary in creating this program and that were in a position to make the decision to move forward with it. So I think it's really important as we listen to the panelists over the next 2 days to remember that we might not necessarily all have access to the same resources in our counties, but if we begin by taking an inventory of what we do have and then determining who's necessary to create the leadership circles that are necessary to move forward, it's a great place to start, and I think April gave a great example of how that can be done in a town like Cottonwood, so yeah, which is very nice. The other thing that I think I'd like to add too is as we do address the 6 questions that are foundational for stepping up, we're actually addressing those questions in a sort of indirect way, but we're doing it as they pertain to the intercept that we're looking at. So we're looking at intercept 1 on the model. And so one of the things that I was hoping that people would come away with as we're going through these questions too the participation of the panelists is that it's a very linear model, and that for people to arrive at intercept 1, there's something that brought them to their first engagement with law enforcement or with crisis services, and perhaps they didn't have necessarily the supports that they needed prior to ending up in crisis. But it's very important that as we work along the sequential intercept model that we, 1, kind of understand how an individual ended up on our doorstep and is requiring our service, and 2, what our role is while they're with us at that intercept, and 3, what will happen to them if we fail them by not providing them with the services they need on that intercept. So if we can keep that all in mind as we're going through this process, I think it will help a lot. It helped me, I know that. So moving on. I had the privilege of having lunch with Dr. Balfour and Jason Winsky not too long ago down in Tucson. Had I don't know what the place was, but it was great fries. They were amazing, and so I don't remember what that place was, but it was good, and I want to go back. And while we were there, I had an opportunity to speak with the 2 of them and what they're doing down in Tucson and Pima County. And so the next question we want to direct towards you, Dr. Balfour. And you work a lot with people who are in crisis, and you work a lot with the Tucson Police Department. In fact, their mental health investigative support team, MIST as it's so called now. And the objective of that is to transition individuals from away from incarceration and into proper supportive care. Can you share with us a little bit about what that looks like for you, and as well as the importance of conducting timely screening and assessments and how that plays into things for you?
Sure. Thanks for having me. And so I'm with Connections AZ, and so like you were saying, we have the Crisis Response Center down in Tucson, and then also our big sister facility, the UPC up in Phoenix. But both of these facilities were really created specifically to do that first intercept, which is to provide an alternative for the police to bring people instead of to jail, and especially the CRC, since it was mostly driven by the county and a bond election that created it. And I think it's really important to say, first of all, in terms of the timely assessment, that not just for the person receiving services does it need to be timely, but also for law enforcement. And in Arizona, we sometimes, I think, forget the importance of this because it's so imbued in our culture here. Quick turnaround for law enforcement is important because other states are not like that. I travel around the country, and we were riding around with the LAPD last year, and they were all happy that this new facility had the officers wait only 4 hours. And Jason told them that, well, you know, in Tucson they wait 5 minutes, and they didn't believe us. So it's really, we should all pat ourselves on the back for the fact that all of our crisis facilities, not just us, but our partners at Recovery Innovation and Community Bridges, they all ascribe to this model. Because if the goal is to keep people out of jail, then we have to view law enforcement as a customer just as much as we view the person receiving services. And for them, a lot of what they're driven by is speed, because they're busy. They got crimes to fight and rioting basketball fans to protect us from. And so if it takes 20 minutes to book somebody into the jail, it needs to take 10 minutes or less to bring somebody for services. So at the CRC, we keep that below 10 minutes. That's our target, but it's usually much below that. And then for kids, it's a little bit longer, 20 minutes, which was over an hour when we first started managing that. So it's a little longer for the kids because there's no emergency applications and someone has to sign them in. But we worked with DCS to have a way to get the kid brought in much quicker if we can't find somebody to receive them, to consent for their services. So that's for the officer. So when you can't let them wait around, just send them on out their way. And then as far as the person receiving services, then a timely assessment is hugely important because the point of the assessment is to guide treatment. And our mission is to start treatment as soon as possible. And in our experience, the sooner treatment is started, it ripples down and has all of these other positive effects. So when we first took over the management of the CRC, the door-to-doctor time was like 8.5 hours, and now it's about 90 minutes is the median. And when you do that, then the person's getting what they need quicker. So whether that's medications to help them regain control, to help with their symptoms, to help with their anxiety, as well as discharge planning, so meeting with our social workers and starting to work on what is it that got them into crisis, what were they not getting that they needed to keep them out of crisis, or if they're new to the system, what do we need to hook them into so that they're able to do well in the community. We found that decreasing that time to assessment also decreased our amount of restraints and assaults and injuries, which are better for everybody, because really people need to get treatment started. And then if you do that, we've also found that most people who look pretty sick, and if they were waiting in an ER somewhere, would probably, and they're not going to get any treatment, where they're just basically psych, not psych. Okay, psych, you wait in a bed, for days for an inpatient bed. A lot of those people don't need to go to the hospital if you can start treatment earlier and get them all the things that they need. And we're able to do that because we start the treatment early, but also because of our partnerships. So we're very fortunate in both of our facilities to have good partnerships with our regional behavioral health authorities, so Simpatico in the south and MMIC in Phoenix. And again, when I go around to other states, like they kind of don't believe the fact that, our REBO puts a metric on clinics. It says if we call them and say, come down here, they have to be there in an hour. And what? We can't get them on the phone. So it really, the timely assessment is the beginning of it, but it's the partnership and the community collaboration that allows that assessment to turn into treatment that helps these folks stay out of the hospital and then out of jail again, hopefully.
Dr. Balfour, thank you. you work very, very closely with the gentleman to your left, and I know I was impressed when I was down there and had the opportunity to see how that actually worked. I wasn't familiar with MIST, and I wasn't familiar with how lots of things worked in Tucson, so I was grateful for that opportunity. Can you share maybe an example of like a great story of how one worked out really good for you?
Oh, the card. Okay, so actually, yes, we have so many. So actually, Jason posted this on his Facebook, and for Tucson, it went kind of viral because it got like 300 shares or something. But so his team is very unique in that all of the Title 36, like not the emergency apps, but all the PADs and things like that, or revocations or amendments or whatever your county calls it, goes to his team. And so I think there was a PAD on this lady that someone had filed. And so they go to this school, which, and this is Tucson, right? So like there's an abandoned school that's behind a church that basically people just let homeless people live in there, and there's a community garden, and the church kind of like, and it's Tucson, so that's just kind of how it is. And so there's this lady there who's pretty psychotic. She's living in her car. She works in the community garden. The church kind of keeps an eye on her. But there's a PAD out for her, and so he's got a judge's order. He's got to bring her in. And they're chatting with her, and she's, like I said, she's kind of psychotic, but she's not agitated, and she's pleasant. And then he says, well, I have to bring you in for, because there's this order. I have to bring you to the hospital. And then she gets upset. She's like, I don't want to go. Well, since they are so well trained and so in tune, instead of just saying, well, I have a judge's order, so you got to go, they work with her and try to figure out why. And it turns out it's because she's like, I can't leave my car. My whole life is in my car. And if I'm away from here, somebody will steal it. And then basically everything I own will be stolen. And so I can't leave my car. So then Jason calls me and tells me the story. And turns out he found a buddy with a tow truck company who would tow it. And so it's like, well, then let's just put it in the CRC parking lot. So I was like, okay. So we call, so then our people call security, because it's Banner University Security, so we call security, and we're friends with them. So we called in a favor and said, can we have this car like sitting on the parking lot and y'all won't mess with it? And they said, yeah. And then beyond that, we even were able to figure out a place to put it where she could see it from the window of where her hospital room was going to be. So after all of that, I don't know, this took like maybe an hour. Yeah, so after all of that, then Jason's folks tell her what we're going to do, and then she's very grateful and went along with no incident, whereas in many localities, that kind of thing, wouldn't happen.
That's fantastic. It's just creative solutions like that are so empowering, I think, and they just really make us think outside the box and what the possibilities are, about how we can provide services that really make a difference. So that's really, really cool. Thank you for sharing that. The next question we have is kind of targeted towards you, Jason, and that is regarding baseline data. You've obviously evolved the program that you work with, and I know you've got great support from the regional behavioral health authorities and with Margie, Dr. Balfour, and that partnership didn't just form on its own. It actually is evolving and gets better with each passing day. But as that program evolves, part of what's so important is having an understanding of what's working and what's not working. And in order to do that, it does require a certain level of baseline data for you to be able to gauge your success and failures. So would you be willing to share a little bit about what that looks like for you and the work that you do?
Yeah, definitely. So let me just start by saying that, when you talk about law enforcement in this arena in behavioral health, we're talking about a transformational change, a cultural change for police officers. And I think that's worth mentioning because, in law enforcement training, when we talk about something like, let's say Denver gets a new patrol car, right? We're going to send 2 officers up to Denver. They're going to drive the car. They're going to come back to Tucson. We're going to buy one of those cars. We're going to drive it for a while. If we like it, then we buy more. That's not what we're talking about when we're talking about mental health training and mental health culture in a police department. It's recognizing that we've really been missing from the table. All of you who are in this room have been working with this population for years and in some cases decades. We're the ones as law enforcement that have been really missing from this table. And so having a dedicated, not designated, but dedicated mental health team in Tucson has been a real transformational shift for us. The Pima County Sheriff's Department, about almost 4 years ago, took a look around our community and said, how are we engaging, how are we at the table this way with behavioral health and with persons in crisis in our community? And they found a real gap there. And so they started the first mental health support team in our community, and the Tucson Police Department, where I work, was soon to follow. So the first question that we get is, well, where is the work, and what is the work, and why does a police department need to have a dedicated mental health team? And so data collection is really at the heart of everything that we do. So we keep an awful lot of data on the mental health team in Tucson, but this one here on the screen to my right is probably one of the most interesting ones, because it's one of the pieces of data that we have that actually goes back the longest. I know it's kind of hard to see. I've got my little pointer here, so try not to blind everybody up here. Over here is the year 2000, and then over here is 2016. And so a question that we get all the time is, well, how do you justify having a mental health team? Or how do you justify the expense of having a mental health team? And this is a big component of that data right here. These are mental health transports accomplished by the Tucson Police Department year over year, and it's 15, 16 years worth of data. And as you can see, it's very linear. It's been going up and up and up every year that we've been doing this. And I want to just remind everybody, so we're not talking about chest pain or car accidents or anything like that. This is exclusively mental health related transports, both voluntary and involuntary. And the other kind of interesting thing about this graph is there's a couple of noticeable increases in this graph. The first is 2003, 2004, right about here, when we had the tech bubble, right? We had the dip in the economy. And then, of course, over here, as we get into 08, 09, the economy crashed entirely. So we see a significant increase right here. And then, of course, in 2016, there was a presidential election. So we see that was a joke. But truth be told, actually, we are kind of drilling down into this data here from 2015 to 2016, because we increased almost 1,000 transports in a single year. And another kind of interesting piece about this kind of baseline data is, there's a couple different ways to look at this, because you can look at, 2003, 2004, and then, 08 to, 2010 and say, all right, well, we had significant unemployment, we had economic, factors there. But you know what else we had between, 2012 and 2016 was we had additional resources for mental health added and substance abuse added to our community. We had increased public education. The police departments, both major police departments in our community, started mental health teams. So there's different ways to look at this data, which I find very interesting. One is, wow, look at this significant problem that we have, because these transports are going up. The other is to say, actually, we have more community engagement, that people are aware of the resources that we have. The police department's meeting people where they're at in the community. We're diverting people away from the jail and into treatment facilities. And for us, it's really, it's been a great experience having a dedicated mental health team. But like the other panelists have said, none of this would work for a police department. It's kind of an interesting position to come to the table when you're the one that's been missing, and then ask for help, and then ask for additional resources, and ask for more money, right, and bodies. But the collaboration that we have in Pima County, whether it's the Sheriff's Department, the County Attorney's Office, Simpatico, Connections AZ, which runs our crisis center, Community Bridges, all of those various things really represent a continuum in Pima County, and that's what we're trying to reflect back as a police department. So out there in the community, community-wide resources, there's a continuum. All the way from Intercept, what we call zero. Kate Lawson's in the crowd there. I call her the forefather, right, of Intercept Zero. Pre-arrest, all the way through arrest and trial and post-conviction with programs like DTAP at the County Attorney's Office. So out there in the community, there's a continuum of these resources, and we're just trying to match that as a police department, so that we're not always just resorting to that tool to say, okay, we have this person, so it's the ER or the jail. And by the way, 3 or 4 years into having a mental health team now, we're kind of graduating to that step now, where we're looking at the ER and the ED admissions, because I don't think that's a very good deflection either from the jail. Does that answer your question?
Yes, and I think it's great that you kind of explained a little bit about how raw data doesn't necessarily tell the whole story. I mean, if you were to look at that, as you mentioned, and then really get to the explanation that having additional funding and actually being able to handle more mental health transports, it's not just important to have the data, but actually to give it meaning, and I think you've done that, and that's really important. in terms of improvements that you see that, I mean, I guess are there things that you think that you could address that through looking at the baseline data that you've accumulated over the last several years, gives you?
So looking at the continuum that we're talking about in law enforcement, going back 5-10 years ago, it was we were either going to let you go or you were going to the jail. That was basically it. Now we're looking at we can let you go, you can go to the jail, or now we have the crisis center, or in some cases an ED if you're looking at a substance abuse issues sometimes. Although with Community Bridges now, they're tackling a lot of those issues for us down in Tucson. A program that we just launched earlier this month, and we're kind of beta testing right now, is what we're calling the co-responder program. A bunch of us from Tucson went out and shadowed LAPD. They have a co-responder program out there which basically takes a trained mental health officer and pairs them with a behavioral health professional. So in Tucson, they're called crisis mobile teams. They used to be called MAC teams. I'm not sure in the Phoenix area or up north what they're called, but these are the mobile teams that go out. And what we looked at is, so someone calls 911, we send a police officer or a deputy out. The deputy gets there and says, or the officer gets there and says, I think we need a crisis mobile team. We need a mobile team out here. So then we dispatch from a separate location a mobile team. And it's amazing that we didn't think of this sooner, but why not put both of those resources in the same car? And you're going to accomplish quite a few things by that. One is just the efficiency of time, because they're dispatching together and they arrive together. But really what you're going to accomplish there is deflection away from unnecessary hospitalizations, unnecessary incarcerations, and even unnecessary transports to the crisis center. And so why is that? Well, it's because the behavioral health professional and the mental health officer are going to get the same evaluation at the exact same time of the person who's in crisis. Police officers are really persuasive. I don't know if you guys know that. There's some type A personalities in my field. And when we wait 30 minutes, or in some locations an hour for a mobile team, we've already decided what's happening with that person. I'm just telling you guys, I'll let you know a little trade secret. By the time you guys get there, we try to be respectful and let you guys do your thing and do your fresh evaluation. But if we've been interacting with someone for an hour and a half, and you've got 2 officers or 2 deputies there, they've made a decision about what's going to happen with that person. And so what we're trying to do by pairing those resources together in one vehicle is the officer and the mental health professional are going to get the exact same evaluation, a fresh look at the person at the same time. And we think that that's going to lead to more community stabilization and better outcomes for people.
That's awesome. Thank you, Jason. It actually allows us to segue into question 4. Actually, I'll ask to pass the mic down to Michelle, actually. And when I first met Michelle, she was actually providing case management services to our population, and the one thing that impressed me was her passion, and her love to serve the membership that we serve. And when we talk about pairing services and being aware of what services are out there, it's a lot of times it's funny as I've kind of learned a little bit more, and I continue to learn each day. I begin to realize that a lot of the services are out there. We're just not aware of them. And as that's 3 on our list of objectives for the Stepping Up initiative, it really is connecting services with individuals, but it's very difficult to connect services with individuals if we don't know that they exist or how to access them. So our next panelist, Michelle Swan, actually has a great history of providing services and utilizing services within the community to serve our membership. And I'll ask you, Michelle, to share a little bit about what you do and how that looks when it comes to conducting a comprehensive process analysis and an inventory of our services.
Definitely. I'm very thankful to be here. When it comes down to that first intercept and hopefully the intercept 0, the idea is that my team, I work for a forensic act team. We are our own mobile team. We serve some of the SMI population who have the highest acute needs. And the objective always is to keep them out of incarceration, and likelihood is to not have any contact with PD or to enter into the emergency department. So in essence, if they do make that contact, I want to be the first one to be called. I'm the supervisor of the team and or our 24-hour on-call line. We want to respond immediately. We want to be that person to go out and see that member. We know that member besides the county crisis line, they don't know the member. So if I come out and I see someone who's experiencing some sort of psychosis or issues with regard to their mental health diagnoses, hopefully I have already developed a level of rapport with that person, and the officer and or fire department who's there with the member, they're going to rely heavily on my relationship with that member and helping to de-escalate a crisis and allowing that member to look at me and say, okay, what is it that we need to do to help you not get in the back of that officer's car or have to get into the ambulance. And likelihood is it is something very simplistic. It is something very basic needs basis. And I know we've talked about the homeless population and there being a number of people without a place to live who are dealing with mental health disorders. So oftentimes, again, with what I do on a forensic act team is I want to identify the need and address it. And luckily, I can count numerous times where an officer has called me directly, which is super efficient, because the member has asked them. They'll say, hey, call Michelle. Michelle knows. Michelle, she knows, because they don't want to get in the back of the car. First off, but they will ask for that assistance. So I've gotten phone calls from PD directly, and we've gotten, of course, the calls via dispatch from the crisis line, because the police officer has had to go that route, maybe because the member can't verbalize what is going on and the fact that they have a solid support team in the community. So either way, the concept is that we are able to meet that person in the community and de-escalate whatever the crisis is, and meet their need. And oftentimes when it is a co-occurring disorder issue, we have the availability to put them in our car, in our community bridges car, and take them to the nearest crisis facility to help manage what might be going on as far as signs and symptoms of withdrawal from a substance. And then, of course, when it comes down to the community services, the resources, oftentimes I'm going to look to the member to get some assistance. They know. They've lived in this community. They've lived with their diagnoses for quite some time. They have experience in what's out there, so we rely on that to include networking with other providers. As it's been said before, it's not just Community Bridges doing this. There are tons of providers out there who are hoping and praying to make sure that this member stays out of the criminal justice system. So I'm going to connect with that other provider. I'm going to make sure that these other agencies are aware of what I know, so that we can, all in all, meet the members' needs and, bottom line, keep them out of the criminal justice system.
Thank you, Michelle. As I think it was you, Jason, that mentioned, or it was you, Dr. Balfour, that mentioned Intercept Zero and how Kate Lawson is kind of the, okay, Jason. And I want to bring that up because it's super important. As Michelle talks about connecting with resources, you know, a lot of the people and for law enforcement in the room that can attest to, a lot of the calls that you get are for people who are committing crimes of what we would call crimes of necessity. You know, the ones that could have been met if their lower Maslow hierarchy of needs were met, if they had housing, if they had access to the proper medication, if they had access to food and a place to sleep, if they had all of those things in clothing, then they may not find themselves in situations where they are trespassing or committing shoplifting for, you know, a stick of deodorant or what have you. So the idea is, if we look at Intercept Zero, the goal is, of course, to connect them with resources before they ever reach Intercept One. And if we can reduce the number of people as we move along the intercept, then hopefully we can divert more and more people away from the criminal justice system before they penetrate deeper into the model. So a lot of what you do, Michelle, and your team does, and case managers around the state, is really build kind of an inventory of what ways you can help them to prevent in the first place from them having an engagement with crisis or with law enforcement. And I think that that's something that you had mentioned, that going to the actual members themselves, oftentimes they're a great resource for housing when there's restrictions on them for housing and things like that. And I think that you had mentioned earlier too about, we had talked a little bit about just connecting with people in the community and identifying what kinds of resources are there. It's such a huge part of stepping up, and I think that that's something that begins with each of you asking the questions, asking not only what are other people doing within your community to provide services to this population, but it's also asking for help, because each of you plays a role of providing a solution to someone's problem. And oftentimes, we don't know that the person has the problem unless they come to the table with it. And so the same could be said of each one of us. If we don't come to the table asking for help in a particular area, then someone who makes it their business to provide the solution to that problem can't know that they need to provide that solution to you. So a lot of it's communication. So I compel you to go back to your communities at the end of the summit and ask for help more often and let people do that for you. So thank you, Michelle.
Am I on? So this morning, Natasha talked about the different questions and leading up to the one regarding policy, practice, funding improvement, and that sometimes it comes at this step around number 5, but sometimes all of these efforts happen pretty much at the same time. Years ago, Flagstaff Police Department made an identification that they were responding to individuals with mental health needs, and what is it that we were supposed to do? We as a department from Flagstaff Police Department were supposed to do when responding to individuals. So Sergeant Runge, over the past few years, there's been pretty much a consistent policy in place, but perhaps the practice has been a little bit different. Can you walk us through how you guys identified that this was a gap, how you identified what that policy and that practice was going to look like, and how you connected the dots with the service providers involved as well, and that it's how it has sustained over the years?
Thank you, Bea. Can everybody hear me? Well, one of the ways that we identified it is Chief Kevin Treadway he's a pretty insightful guy. And he started noting things outside of what he thinks in a different way than the typical law enforcement officer does. He's very about the numbers, and he starts looking at the data. And he starts realizing that we're contacting a lot of individuals who are repeat customers. For instance, they come to jail on petty offenses, we take them to jail, and he doesn't. Well, part of his theory on the purpose of law enforcement is to change behavior. And if we're using punishment or punitive methods in our court systems to change behavior and it's ineffective, it's the most expensive thing we could possibly be doing. It's the wrong response. And so as he started looking at these things, he started saying, well, how do we fix it? He started reaching out to, at the time it was NARBA, was our Regional Behavioral Health Authority, and saying, how can we do this? We're also a border town, and we have a diverse interests from a lot of different communities, so it gets a little complicated. We looked at models from outside agencies, and we always look to larger agencies, generally Mesa, Phoenix, the Valley agencies, generally speaking. But what we saw was that a lot of times you can take what works in a large community and it will not work in a small community. But generally speaking, you can take what works in a small community and it will work in a large community provided the right dynamics. So he started sending us down here to crisis intervention training, and we received some great valuable training in many ways. The communications and those type of things were wonderful and they were valuable. What we found was the resources didn't work. So we tried to implement the methods and it was ineffective. So then let's go back to the drawing boards again, like we always do when we make a mistake, right? And we start trying to realize, well, what are the bigger problems? Why isn't this working? And we started seeing there's a giant cultural difference between the way health responds to a crisis and the way criminal justice responds to a crisis. So we started working together and we started realizing how many silos we were in. And we were all doing what was in our own interest in reference to our own budgets and with using our own resources the most effectively without looking at the impact as a whole. So we had lost sight of the big picture. So we started kind of collaborating and walking to different agencies, meeting with them and saying, hey, what do we need? How can we work more effectively? What is missing from this? And I have to say, the county, Coconino County also, at the same time, they were in communication with the chiefs and stuff like that. So one of the things that that we had to say when I talk about policy is that great leadership, as April was discussing, is essential. But every one of us is a leader and we're a follower at the same time. So understanding the concepts of followership is also very important. And we have to have guidelines to follow. Generally speaking, when you look out at law enforcement and the way they respond, they have two choices. They can arrest or they can not arrest. That's it. That's really their own choices. And laws often mandate which choice they're going to make. If it's domestic violence, we have to make an arrest. It doesn't matter what there is. The other thing is a lack of information. If I don't know the information, I can't use it in my decision making to divert. So certain regulations that we have, HIPAA might be a part of it, but CFR 42 regulations also can inhibit communication between health agencies and law enforcement agencies. If the officer on the street does not know that the person has a mental health diagnosis, they can't use it in their decision to decide to arrest or not to arrest. The other thing we want to talk about, I guess, is a little bit of resources. Generally speaking, officers on the street, patrol officers, are probably 22 to 27 years old. Therefore, they have a limited amount of world experience. And they generally didn't come into police work because they wanted to be health workers. That's not why they came into police work. They did come into police work to help people. And as they gain experience, they learn the different ways that they can actually be very, very effective in helping people. So when we started looking at all these different dynamics, this complicated system, as the senator was talking about, it is very complicated, and started saying, what resources? Do we lack resources? Well, oftentimes it wasn't that we lacked resources. We just had to find creative solutions to find those. Find those pools of money, as she was discussing, right? Find those little pockets of manpower, of assistance. And we found that through collaborations with other entities, working with Coconino County Sheriff's Office, working with Health Choice Integrated Care, working with the Guidance Center, and these other things. And as I think you'll see, what we're all talking about up here is collaboration across the community rather than operating solely in our own silos. So we depend on our leadership of to develop good policies and procedures that we can follow, that are easy to read, understandable, and very consistent. April was also talking about consistency across responses. We can't teach officers across an entire state a different way to respond when we're all Arizona State peace officers, right? We all go to similar academies. They provide similar training. It's a very big industry. And so as the people come out, we need a consistent way to train them so that when Officer B from Tucson is coming up to Flagstaff to help me and we're going to raid, we have to kind of know what to expect from each other. It's a safety issue. Not just to protect the safety of the individual consumer who may be out there or the victim, but also protect their safety, society, and the officers themselves. So we kind of have to look at different perspectives of how we respond and what our role and purpose is. Generally speaking, the role of criminal justice system is to protect the rest of society who's not there in the middle of the crisis, right? We're there to contain a crisis and prevent that crisis from spreading bigger and impacting the other individuals who are not there. That is not the role of healthcare. Healthcare is there to provide and protect that individual and not make their particular situation work. So without collaboration, how do we mesh our work together? How do we provide that? We can provide the best treatment for that individual on the scene is generally what's best for society in the long term, but you still have to stop the crisis immediately. So I might be getting a little off topic. I speak in circles. I promise there is nothing. What we talk about when we're talking about developing policy and procedures, it has to be consistent with what the roles of each agency is. So each agency has to understand the roles of the other agency and then work together to close those gaps. Some of the gaps we do through forming the Criminal Justice Coordination Council, where different entities get together and they say, hey, what's our community problem? We look at that problem and say, how can we work together? How can we mesh it? We look at data, like what Jason was talking about, bringing the data together and developing systems within, at least the Flagstaff Police Department. We do crisis intervention forms, which is a data collection that's made by the officer and their observation and then provided at the subsequent levels in the sequential intercepts model. So it can be provided to the next step to know, hey, what were this person's observations? What did they see? What did they not see? I will tell you, generally speaking, law enforcement wouldn't become involved if there wasn't a breakdown of some sort in sequential intercept 0, right? So if we had perfect systems in place to protect everybody, law enforcement would never become involved in mental illness. So we kind of have to look at providing those services on that. But when there is a breakdown, and it's almost guaranteed because we're fallible human beings that there will be a breakdown in these different systems, that when we become involved, how can we divert as many people as possible? Understanding that there's a gap between 5 and 17% of people who are incarcerated, right, in comparison to the general population. And that's, when we talk about sequential intercepts 1, that's not going to solve all 17%. That's only going to solve 2, 3%, right, if we can divert more people at that front end. So what we ask for from our leaders is to provide that guide, that model. I think that the sequential intercepts model is a good model that can kind of list different areas step by step, and it can be applied in rural areas as well as metropolitan areas. The difference in some of this might be the level of training that each individual person that's responding to any given scene receives. I think that there has been a lot of collaboration, and we're moving in a very good direction. I think things are better than they were 10 years ago. We're getting a lot more guidance, and recently the International Association of Chiefs of Police and the National Sheriff's Association pushed the One Mind campaign, and that is to provide training to law enforcement, first responders, the 22 to 27-year-old guys that I talked about in mental health first aid. What they're asking is that 25% of law enforcement personnel receive crisis intervention training, and that 100% of first responders receive mental health first aid. Mental health first aid is an 8-hour training, crisis intervention being a 40-hour training. So if resources are needed, they have to be provided to those individuals who are making the decision on the front end, which is the patrol officers. And that means that they have to have an understanding on how to identify illness, how to be aware of it, and receive funding for that training so that they can continue to use it and save costs in the long run. I'll give an example of where our system has kind of responded. Through these collaborations, we didn't have a crisis response team that responded to the community for a number of years. And it took a long time for us to break down barriers between our silos. But when we finally did start breaking those barriers down, then we started seeing a lot of advances. And I have to give a lot of credit to Bea, because she was able to go meet with these agencies separately and then somehow get them to the table all together at one time, which probably took, I don't know how many countless hours she probably spent trying to do that. It was a difficult situation. I don't know how many, it probably took about 5 years off her life. But she finally did get them to the table, and once she got them all to the table, we were able to make differences. And one of the things that they learned was, again, time being the essence of law enforcement, we started addressing that issue, and then they started contracting with agencies like Teros and providing community response. The Guidance Center opened their unit and created this chair system where law enforcement could drop them off in an open door policy, and they would figure out the rest. What we have done since that time, and we can document it with numbers, is that although the officers spend the same amount of time on scene with the individual, waiting for the response and those type of things, we've seen our time spent sitting in facilities cut in half. And every minute that an officer is spending with a suicidal person is a minute that a gun is involved in their life. It's generally something we don't want to encourage, is that. It's also another imposing authority. It's also another chance that they're going to do something right in front of that officer, and he's going to have to take action, and then it's going to enter the criminal justice system under a possible felony. And it creates this thing when it may have been able to be handled by the health system. So what we would like to ask is that as leaders in this community, I can say everybody in here is in their own respective areas, is that clear, concise, simple policies are put in place that function very well between entities and across disciplines.
You had mentioned actually collecting numbers. And I even kind of got into a stumped conversation earlier this week because I had some anecdotal information of why things were changing. And I was asked, what were the numbers? I don't have the numbers. However, I was talking about April's program, and because of the way that it was developed, when it was developed, and how it was developed, we were smart enough to say maybe we should track some numbers. And tracking progress is one of the 6 questions, and there's a huge relevance and importance behind it. And so, April, it'd be great if you could go back and talk about what decision points were made when you started, what you tracked, what it looks like, and different areas along the way that you've used that information, even times that you weren't even expecting to. I know Sheriff Masher used it this morning, and it sounds very powerful, but how did that come across, and what does that data collection look like?
Yes, well, I know that all of you get really excited about data and collecting data. And I, too, share your excitement, really not at all. And so, but I did know that when we started this, we really needed to make sure that we were collecting numbers from the very beginning in order to prove why we needed to sustain this program later on. We weren't sure at that time how it was going to work, if it was going to work, if people were going to use it, if there was going to be a demand. But I hounded my team as Carrie. I brought Carrie as a witness, basically, because she was there from the beginning. And I asked her all the time, how are we going to collect these numbers? When we start this program, we need to make sure that we're tracking the utilization, because someday we're going to be, I think I even said this to Carrie, I said, someday I'm going to be sitting on a stage somewhere citing these numbers, and I want to make sure that we have the data to support them. And so we knew that tracking was going to be important from the beginning, and we weren't exactly sure all that we were going to want to track in the end, but we did know that we wanted to track initially every single call that came in and what the response time was to get to that call in the field, because one of the objectives, as you all know, is to respond to law enforcement in real time and get them on to their next job, protecting the safety of the public rather than providing mental health treatment in the field. And so we wanted to make sure that we were having good response times, and then we wanted to track the disposition of those calls. And so we tracked from the very beginning, from day one, go live, February 1st of 2016. We've tracked every single call that's ever come in to law enforcement. And I also want to add, because I think it's important and because I want to brag, that we initially set out to pilot this program for 90 days to law enforcement only. And we had this plan. We had a well thought out plan, we thought, to kind of slowly introduce this program to the community as well. But we found out pretty early on into this project that the community needed this response now, and just as much as law enforcement needed it in the field. So we started responding to the community as well. And so we have 2 sets of data points to support the impact and success of this mobile crisis response. So early on, we brought to each monthly meeting, remember I alluded to the monthly meetings that we have with law enforcement on a regular basis, and we brought all of the data from all of the calls that we had gone on each time, and we broke it down by agency, because we have 8 agencies, and we wanted to demonstrate, the utilization of each of these agencies. And then that data, as it was given to them, they were able to go back to their respective officers and agencies and say, why have calls declined from Sedona PD? They were up in this month, now we don't have this many. Or why is the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office not calling as much? What's going on with this particular individual? So those things were really helpful in troubleshooting a lot of the issues that came up. But mostly what's been most illuminating and most helpful in talks like this is to be able to say things like, of the 481 calls that we got from law enforcement, we had average response times of 30 minutes or less. Wasn't always the case. In the beginning, it took us 45, 50 minutes. We're responding to every corner of our geographic service area, which is pretty vast. And so as we've been able to troubleshoot some of those issues and determine the highest volume areas, we've been able to place staff strategically. So that's been a critical component of tracking progress, as well as being able to say things like, of the 481 calls that we responded to, we were able to community stabilize 60% of those calls. And that means that we were able to keep people in their homes, in their communities, in that moment, so that their jobs weren't disrupted, their lives weren't disrupted, they didn't lose their housing and all the different things that come along with going to jail. And then on the community side of things, we were tracking every single call along with that. And this is a lot of data that we have now stored in spreadsheets. And we responded to over 1,400 calls to the community. And we were also finding that as law enforcement was going out and activating our service, the community was finding the service was available, which allowed them to activate the service before calling law enforcement. And so getting at that intercept 0 and making sure that people had a resource ahead of time. So of those 1,400 calls to the community that we responded to, we've community stabilized 60% of those calls. So this is all obviously very useful information to report, and has saved the county millions of dollars in taxpayer money, whether they would have gone to jail or they would have gone to emergency departments. And as I said before, when we started out, Spectrum was directing every single crisis call to the emergency department. If somebody called in crisis, we asked them to meet us in the emergency department. Now, all of you know that if you walk into an emergency department, by virtue of being there, you're going to be subjected to a battery of tests, whether you need them or not, because of liability issues, because of various things. And so a lot of our clients, people served by Spectrum, that we were charged with taking care of, were getting all of these tests in the emergency department and costing at a rate of $10,000 a day for our local hospital. So now all of these people that didn't go there, I'm not good with numbers because I'm in behavioral health, so that's a lot of money. You all can do the math. So you can see the impact of those savings and the importance of tracking that progress. But also, I think it's important that now that we have all this data, and Spectrum has 18 months worth of data, that there are ways that we can partner with our law enforcement partners to find out what else do we want to know. And one of the other things that we're digging into now is, of all of the people that we encounter in the field and we refer to an intake, how many actually come get an intake? And then if they do come get an intake, what is our average length of service and what are the outcomes of those services? And because we have all of this information for 18 months of providing mobile crisis response, we're able to go back and dig that up with our population health manager. And so these are, the next items of data that we'll be using and demonstrating as useful and being able to say this program works. And if we can, and I will tell you, we're 18 months in. This consumed my life for 6 months. There was nothing else that I did but answer calls in the middle of the night and try and make sure that this mobile crisis response unit was going to be successful, was going to work. But now it's running. There are people back in the Verde Valley right now that are on call, that are responding to mobile crisis as we speak on a regular basis, and it runs itself. And if we can do that there, then I feel like everybody in here has the ingredients in their respective areas to bring together. It's just a matter of, applying a lot of these things that we're talking about here today. And it does work, and it does have an impact, and tracking progress and reporting data, whether we like it or not, is one of the biggest, most important parts of that.
Well, I want to reiterate that too, because a lot of folks in this field, in the behavioral health field, we're the touchy-feely people, and we just want to, and we're not the money folks. And part of stepping up and changing the world is definitely the money folks, or trying to find those pockets of funds at the legislative money that Senator Allen was talking about, and how to shift them. And so I was thinking about your number. I get myself in trouble because I'm a social worker. I'm going to do some math. How many people get booked a year into your jail? So out of 18 months, that's people got diverted from getting booked in. It's too hard of a percentage. That's going to be low, right? 16,000?
What do you
Well, I'm trying to think of the percentage. If there was about 300 people a year getting diverted from getting booked into jail, that's a percentage of people not going into the jail. Right, okay. I'm not going to even try to find that math. But then I'm looking at Jason's math that says 5,000 people in 1 year got diverted out. And how many people get booked into the Tucson jail?
A lot more than that, a lot more than that.
Right, like it's a ton, but still, But the money, and it's just something worth out there to keep trying to track, to look for those pots of funds and how to divert. Crisis response is not funded through the state the same as a fire station is funded through the state. So the REBAs pay the Spectrums of the world price per call. And when you have a rural landmass that is so great with so few people out there, to keep April's staff on call 24/7 to respond out to law enforcement within 30 minutes is going to tax somebody's pocket. And so trying to make this system work and trying to divert, it takes this collaboration plus all the money and statistics that, we'll keep away from Bea. 40,000 folks? Okay. Bookings. Well, at least there's a 4 and a 4 both in there. So somewhere in there's probably like a 1%. Back to folks like Senator Allen to give some more power to going back to our leaders. So it takes the folks on the ground and the mid-level and our leadership up above to collect all of this information, not only to fix the gaps, but to keep putting us in the right position to answer the call at Intercept 1. Brett's looking at me.
Yeah. I think, and it's as we go back through it, especially as we look at what Corey shared with us and April shared with us, when we look at possibilities for funding improvements and tracking our data, the tracking our data part becomes so difficult because as Bea was saying, you may save money somewhere, or you may have an expense somewhere, but you don't see it directly correlated to where it's saving money perhaps in damages done to the community, or it's hard to tie it all together. But what you can always come back to is that the earlier that we can intervene in someone's life and provide them with the services that they need to be provided with, the less cost that it will cost us in the long run. But that's like saying, well, Brett, if we had plenty of houses for everybody to live in, we wouldn't have a housing shortage or a housing problem. So if we were to be able to have adequate, or I shouldn't say adequate, but in quantity enough care to be able to provide the services to all of our individuals so that they weren't without housing or without food or weren't without the things that they needed to survive day to day, then they wouldn't end up utilizing police resources, which wouldn't end up utilizing jail resources, wouldn't end up increasing. And so it's all linear, and the earlier that we can catch it, the better. But the only way we're going to be able to see how that all works is by collecting the data and then figuring out how data on one end impacts data on the other end. And that is a huge span to be able to connect those two sets of data, because they may be related, but just in an odd way, and sometimes very difficult to figure out. Yeah, Margie, hold on, let me get this to you. Oh, you got one.
Because maybe I'm weird because I'm a psychiatrist and I love data. I'm nerdy. But I think not only can data prove outcomes and cost effectiveness, but I think it also can guide what we want our services to be. We collect a ton of data at the CRC, and I think if you think about it, every time somebody comes into crisis, it's a story. It's a story of how something didn't work for them in the community. For law enforcement, we're talking about Intercept 0. For people not in the justice system, it's just community care. Something didn't work for them. I couldn't get my meds filled. I tried to call my case manager, and they couldn't call me back, or I couldn't get seen, whatever. Something didn't work for them. And so we actually started this really cool project about a year ago with Simpatico, where we said, well, let's try to use that data to harness that to see how we can improve the overall system. But they're an insurance company, so where does their data come from? Claims, right? Like bills, and those are 90 days old. So you can be looking at data for 3 months in the past, and it's hard to get a jump on that. So we developed this, and we went through all the HIPAA stuff, and a daily data feed of everybody who goes through there. And then, they're in teams, they have an army of analysts who can analyze it. And so through that, we started looking at trends of who's coming through and why, and what clinics they belong to, and what's their payer source, and what's the reason why they came. And then would have regular phone calls with high-level decision makers at both the CRC and at Simpatico to be able to do some interventions based on that. So like, for example, for the kids, a bunch of the calls were coming from the schools, so they did a special thing with the mobile teams to respond to the schools and things like that. For the adults, we focused on high utilizers. And so we looked at our utilization and came up with a definition for high utilizer, which is like, I think it was like 4 visits in 4 months. And there were 64 people on the original list, and a year later, only 7 of those people are still on the list. And then there's only 35 people that meet that definition. So not only do we help those 60-something individuals, but we've decreased the number of people cycling through, and our readmissions have gone down as well. And so now, based on the success of that, we just recently, a couple of weeks ago, had a meeting with the county because Pima County is full of nerds, because Pima County loves data too. And they have a MacArthur grant, and they do all this cool, and I don't know if it's going to be one of the other panels, and they may talk about it, but they do all this cool stuff with this data matching with jail bookings match with Simpatico, and they can analyze it and stuff. And we've noticed that in our shop, there's an increase in Title 36 population. And so how does that interact with the jail population? Because we know that there's some people who get serial applications, and then they never get court ordered, and then they end up in jail. And then like what's going on with the other one. So we're going to start something similar with the county, where a bunch of people are going to get together and have a data work group and start to share this data, and part of that will be the CRC contributing that data. So not only is data important for outcomes, but I think it's very important for system design, and if you collaborate well and kind of agree on what you should be looking at.
Thank you. Okay, so we had a few of you touch on the importance of gathering leadership outside of your discipline and what that looks like and how important it is. Jason and Michelle, would you want to add a little bit to what the collaboration of outside leadership has done to
Yeah,
increase?
absolutely. Again, we're very lucky in Tucson and in Pima County. I see the folks from NAMI over there. They are great partners for us at the Tucson Police Department and the Pima County Sheriff's Department. I touched a little bit on training earlier, and we talked about how, about 95% of all law enforcement training is one officer learning something and then teaching it to another officer, right? That's almost the entirety of law enforcement training. CIT, our Crisis Intervention Training Program in Pima County, we have 11 or 12 different police departments across southern Arizona now, and even a little bit north of us, in between us and Phoenix, that come to our CIT program. So it's a really diverse CIT program. About 85 or maybe even 90% of our CIT program is taught by behavioral health professionals, attorneys, judges, professors. The REBA provides teachers, NAMI comes. And that's something that's really unique about our training, and we're very, very lucky and fortunate to have that in our community. Because the reality is, to have a CIT training that's 40 hours of law enforcement teaching law enforcement, it's not going to be as genuine of an experience. So it takes that collaborative effort for training. Mental health first aid is the same way. Simpatico down in Tucson, they have a bunch of mental health first aid instructors, so we'll partner a law enforcement mental health first aid instructor along with one from Simpatico. And that's really the best of both worlds, because if there's law enforcement questions, we can answer that on our side. And then if there's questions about how does the crisis system work, we can answer that through the REBA. So it's really, it takes a lot of different angles and a lot of different people and organizations coming to the table to make our training a success.
Yeah, and I would say it's very similar in my regard as being a person who's on the ground with the member, being able to go to a probation office and have their leadership explain to me what that looks like, parole and probation, community supervision in general, allowing them to explain to me what that looks like in effort for me to help a member stay out of custody. And then in the way of the first responders, like I've been able to sit down with the Phoenix Fire Department and them say, okay, as long as we know what process is in place and the numbers to call and direct cell phones to call, I'll call you if I have a member who's dealing with a mental health disorder or concern in the community. So yeah, again, being able to connect with other entities and other providers who also want to see that member safe, it's priceless. It really is.
And so Jason hit on the same thing we learned up north about the collaboration when you're trying to do training and teach those line personnel, and having somebody involved that's from that culture, teaching that culture, but also somebody with an outside perspective. And one of the tests that I had done was, first we had people just teaching mental health first aid that didn't have a law enforcement perspective. And we started getting terrible reviews on it when we were looking at the things. I mean, law enforcement officers are very critical people. And so they pick little things and they'll pick somebody apart really quick, or just do it. And what we learned was nothing gets done, right? Nothing changes if they didn't buy in. They just shut down and then they don't listen to the rest of the training. So we said, well, we need to send somebody off to training in CIT training. So we sent me to mental health first aid training. I came back and I taught it, and then I put the evals out there, and I'm thinking I nailed this. And they beat me up. And they says, well, we already know what you're going to say. Like that. So it was kind of if you do, you're damned, and if you don't, you're damned. So when we started pairing up, we started hitting both angles of it. And then our reviews went through the roof. We started seeing the collaboration, and we were able to learn each other's culture, and we were able as instructors to bring that back to our own entity, and I was able to learn from the health side of things and bring that back and answer questions on behalf of the health side. We also learned that as we're presenting, when I'm teaching my own agency or I'm teaching a law enforcement group, that the health instructor doesn't confront law enforcement about that, because they're going to get beat up on the training. And so if we're training law enforcement, it's up to that law enforcement trainer to be the negative Nancy in this and start and call them back and say, no, this does apply and this is how it applies. And the same thing with the health entity. If I go help teach at health entities, I need a partner over there that's willing to stand in front and call them out, because if I try to call them out, there's going to be 1,000 avenues I didn't predict just because I'm not from that culture.
Yeah, we wanted to open up to questions. One thing, Dr. Balfour, that you talked about, I'm kind of stuck on this, sorry. But because I hear it over and over again, whether we're talking with Phoenix or Flagstaff or Tucson, Prescott, the high utilizer. I mean, I love the idea that you first off went in and you looked at the situation, you assessed it, you collected data, and then you realized that. And I know that the same exists with my talks with Mesa PD. They talk about the same thing, that the same number of people are coming through repeatedly, and that they generate a high number of calls. And so you're identifying that that's actually an area that needed focus, and I know other areas, jurisdictions have done the same thing, and then allocating resources to that. I guess that's so important, I think, in this conversation, because it really does allow you to shift resources that would be continually pumped into this continuum. You said you went from, I lost the numbers in there somewhere. You went from...
There were 64 on the original list. A year later, 7 of those individuals are still high utilizers. And then with our definition that we came up with, which was just based on our utilization, there's only 35, I think, people that meet that definition. So there's less high utilizers.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Yeah.
And the way we did that is we'd flag all their charts, and then it really was a collaboration. So all these people all of them were already connected to services. So this idea that the high utilizer is just not connected is kind of a myth, and there's some studies in the emergency medicine literature that bears that out. They all were connected to an agency, and they were all using a lot of services at their agency, but it wasn't the right services that meet their need. So, these are sort of the people they're the 1%, like our services work for the 99%, and then you've got the 1%, and they need something a little different. And it takes leadership and we're very fortunate, I think, in Arizona with our system where we have these REBAs who are a single point of accountability, because through their leadership, they could get everybody involved on the phone or in person, and we would do these multi-agency staffings about that person and go, because then you have all these different perspectives. And so then we would flag all their charts, and so the next time they came in, it'd pop up, and it would say, there's a special plan for this person, call this case manager at this number. One of the best examples, just story examples, was a woman who would get lonely, and she didn't have the world's greatest coping skills, and on the nights and the weekends especially, she would just start kind of churning and just get all anxious, and then she would come in. And so we recognized that, so then her agency started doing outreach and having the warm line call and all that kind of stuff during those times that we knew were vulnerable. she felt very comfortable with us, which is why she came. She felt safe at the CRC. So, you could look at it as, well, she's using all this resources inappropriately and be annoyed at that. Or you can say, well, that's a positive. She's able to form a relationship and feel safe with some care providers. We need to transfer that over in the outpatient world. So there was a peer that was assigned to her for her clinic. And so every time she came in, that was part of the plan. Call that specific peer, her name and number, and have her immediately, and have her meet her at the CRC so that they started to develop that relationship. And in the first quarter of 2016, she had 14 visits, and in the first quarter of this year, she had 1. So that's a kind of an example of what we were trying to do.
That's awesome. Okay, so we've had a lot of comments by the panelists, and what we're hoping is that from around the state that somewhere along the way you said, yeah, but we've got this problem that we can't overcome where we come from, and we're hoping that maybe those things you might be able to address to our panelists and say, well, hey, you seem to have gotten this under control. How did you overcome that barrier? How did you manage to get that set up? Or how did you manage to avoid this problem or this pitfall? And so if any of you came up with those kind of questions in your head as you were listening to the panelists, we'd love you to take this opportunity to ask questions, because this really should be a solution-driven, and we should be able to hopefully find answers and take these back to our communities and implement them to actually make a difference. So what I will ask is, if you do have a question, if you can raise your hand and wait for a microphone to make its way to you, that would be great.
I was just wondering if there's any statistics or follow-up on the high utilizers, if they're showing up in the system in another way or in different places.
That's a good question. I know that's something that we definitely want to look at. We can do that currently with the SMI people because the REBA pays for both the medical and behavioral health. And so for this group, there were a couple that started using the ER more. And I know that there's probably others that we can't tell that because we don't have the data, but that's definitely, something to look at. I know of one particular person that just started going to the ER a whole lot, but that was not on this list. It was a different situation.
I kind of have a comment about the data and how important it is. We're trying to change the way we look at policy at the Capitol, in that we need to start investing money at the front end of problems and not at the end, which we're talking about. We have to change that thinking. And the data helps us do that with other policymakers there who are still not convinced, and then convinced about the importance of trying to find the money to spend at the front end, knowing we'll save them at the end. I mean, on corrections right now, it's about $1 billion a year that's being spent. Not quite that much, I'm rounding it off. But so I'm just encouraging you, we need the data. We need to show this is working. The other part, could you share this? I've heard how the data is stopping the re-entry, but what is happening on the other end when they're going through community bridges? How many people are starting to be able to become more self-sufficient? What's the rewards, the gains that are happening now at the other end? You're catching them over here, and now as they go through the process, what's happening at the end?
So I can only speak for not a mass county or a mass agency. What I represent is a forensic act team of 100 members, and I know that our outcomes are also based on claims. And for my particular team, we have awesome outcomes when it comes down to members not utilizing an emergency department as frequently. And I apologize, I don't have the exact numbers, but I know, according to our fidelity, that we've increased the ability of members having gainful employment, them maintaining independent supportive housing, and decreasing their bookings by mass amounts. And thankfully for me, I can only account for 100, but right now with our forensic act team, we're doing great things.
What I would add to what you're asking about specifically around, how is this making a difference, or what are some of the rewards that we're seeing, is that, when we start this program at Intercept 1 and we're going in to respond to the community before people have been arrested, and then further from that, when we're being called by the community directly and not even involving law enforcement, that often the outcome of that is that we're going into somebody's home and showing them how they can rely on natural supports and resources that already exist around them, so that the next time they don't have to activate a more formalized, higher level of care. And often when we would go into the home and say, when you're in mental health crisis, what you need to do is go to emergency department, and then a higher level of care from that you can do on your own. That's essentially the message we're sending, is that, every single time this happens, you need to activate these higher level, more formalized, more expensive, and generally not as effective levels of care like the emergency department or jail. So when we're going into people's homes at the mobile crisis level and saying, let's take a look around your home, around your community, the natural supports in your area, and talk about how the next time you feel like this, you can connect to those things instead. And even if we have to come out a few more times and help remind you of that, but we develop these robust crisis and safety plans that you can rely on, and we practice it, then ultimately people end up doing that on their own eventually, and it helps to empower them, which really is the long-term goal, is how can you do this on your own without having to rely on all these formalized levels of care.
Hi, I'm Sarah Kosick. I'm with the Pima County Public Defender's Office. So obviously I'm unfortunately on the end when someone has entered the justice system already, and I'm here to help manage that part, so the last couple of intercepts. But I'm curious a little bit about the data, and the graph on the screen is begging the question for me. You did a nice job of contextualizing it in terms of time and chronology and why some of the dips and some of the rises might have occurred, but these are raw numbers, and I'm hoping you might be able to contextualize it in terms of ratios. Are you seeing an equal rise in arrests going to the jail? Are you seeing a decrease, a current decrease? What are the numbers actually telling us about the populations and where they're going, as opposed to just the straight numbers?
So for the Tucson Police Department, I can tell you over the last 12 to 18 months in particular, arrests of adults have decreased. So I don't have that number for you right now. It's probably on another slide. We can talk afterwards, and I can send you all of our data and our PowerPoints. But overall, in our community, adult bookings are trending down. The people that actually run the jail are here, so I'll defer to them if they want to talk a little bit more about that, or pass the mic over. But I think the other point that we want to talk about here, when you look at this graph here, is when we talk about community stabilization, right, that would affect this number too as well. And when we talk about community stabilization, that's not, when law enforcement talks about that, I worry that people hear like, well, we're just going to deny a transport, right? And that's not what we're talking about at all. In fact, the co-responder model that we're testing right now is doing the opposite of that, which is we're leaving the person with resources, and in some cases an emergent appointment, right? So within the next 24 hours, we're working through the Simpatico portal in Tucson and Pima County, we're scheduling them for an appointment with their provider the very next day. So you're right. I mean, there's different ways to look at this data, but I can tell you that over the last couple of years, at least at the Tucson Police Department, adult bookings are decreasing.
If you have a question, please leave your hand up.
I can speak a little bit on, and Flagstaff in general, and probably in northern Arizona, they've decreased a little bit as far as the number of bookings of mentally ill, just because the resources are being developed and the officers have quicker. Some of this is a little hard to categorize, because how do we know what didn't happen? So a lot of times numbers out there, when we're looking at these raw numbers, when an officer goes out and he's had good training and he recognizes a person with mental illness and decides to find natural resources and leave them in place, a lot of times there's not a report about that. He just went out, resolved the issue, and walked away. When if he had made an arrest, there'd be a police report, there's a booking number, and there's this giant paper process behind it, right? And the only thing on these, a lot of times, is maybe a call note that's hidden in a system, in some law enforcement agency system somewhere. So sometimes this data can also be difficult to track. The other thing that can limit some of the tracking on the data that may be collected is it's easy to track data through the criminal justice system. There's a line, we sell the sequential intercepts model, and it kind of follows this based on where the individual goes. But a lot of times that information is protected once it goes to the health system, and it's not fed back to a lot of these data collectors and these public information agencies like law enforcement. So sometimes when it goes to the health agencies, a place like the Regional Behavioral Health Authority or the Tribal Behavioral Health Authority or those kind of entities will be necessary to reach into the criminal justice agencies, reach into the health agencies, and then compile that information themselves.
Hi, I'm Shelley Curran with Mercy Maricopa, and Michelle, I have your numbers if you would like for me to share with the group. Okay. This is for all 3 of the Community Bridges FACT teams, so a total of 300 members from a period of time of August 1st, 2014 through September 30th, 2016. They had an 18% reduction in the number of members who used the emergency room. They had a 19% reduction in the number of members who are reported to be homeless. 76% reduction in the number of bookings into any facility, and a 31% reduction in the number of psychiatric hospital admissions. Great job, Michelle.
First of all, I want to acknowledge you for the incredible work you have done, and thank you for sharing that. My question has to do with what happens beyond the crisis. One of the issues I continually hear is that once you have the person stabilized, the fact that there isn't adequate housing and other resources to keep them stabilized and engaged in our community is a significant issue for this population. Have you had success in overcoming that big obstacle?
You're exactly right. That's a huge challenge. One thing that has worked well for us down in Pima County is that we noticed that there's a lot of folks, the ones who are new to the system or for whatever reason they don't have their access. And some of them you can just look at them and go, man, you're like SMI and Title 19, but they've been too disorganized to get it, or they need some intermediate level of care. They don't need the hospital, but they can't just go out on their own, but because they don't have their access, they can't get into that kind of level of care. And we would have these conversations like, well, he needs to go to a level 2. Well, why can't he go to a level 2? Because he doesn't have access. Why doesn't he have access? He doesn't have an ID. Why doesn't he have an ID? Because he needs a case manager to help him get one. We'll get him a case manager. He can't have a case manager. Why? Because he doesn't have access. Like, seriously. I mean, we would have those conversations. So recognizing that, we've got a program where it's Hope Inc., Dan Haley's organization. They were co-located and they weren't. Now they're co-located again. They're back in the CRC. And it's peer run. They do a 45-day post-crisis wraparound. They'll take them to their appointment. They'll take them to the pharmacy. They check up on them. They help them get their ID, all that hand-holding. So that's something that's been helpful. Housing is a huge issue, and I can't speak to how to solve that in Arizona, but that definitely is a huge issue, especially more permissive housing for people with substance use disorders and have more of a housing first model. But I do think part of the issue is that we actually, because I came from Texas, and we complain in Arizona, but this is places like Shangri-La compared to Texas. And we have a lot of resources, but sometimes they're difficult to access. So programs like that have been very helpful.
I think that you hit on something that's extremely important for legislators and because this is a huge issue across the state in terms of housing, and it's one of the issues that we run into the most probably whenever we encounter a person on our mobile crisis team that has nowhere to go. So it's very difficult to stabilize those situations. However, we have found success in our area, and I think part of it is that I mean, I love to hear about Tucson as well because it's a much larger city than where I'm at, and they're finding creative and innovative ways to solve those problems. The same thing occurs in the Verde Valley, where we have done some extremely creative things to get people into a stable environment where we can provide wraparound services and then follow that person along in the process. But also I think it's important to establish programs whenever you can, like work adjustment training programs, where we can get people who are experiencing some of these serious mental illness issues into work programs where they can learn meaningful work skills, whether they're soft skills or hard skills, and then helping connect, following it even further, which is what we do at Spectrum. And Spectrum is a whole healthcare provider, so we provide the full spectrum, pun intended, of services to our community members for this reason, because when you follow them along from the moment that they intersect with the system all the way to the end and help connect them with meaningful employment in their community, then they're able to get off of Medicaid benefits in a lot of cases, and we have a lot of data that we can share to that end at Spectrum. But that housing piece is where we've had to get creative in terms of finding hotel rooms, finding funds to pay for that, to stabilize people even just 24, 48 hours at a time. So I think that's a really big issue to tackle that we do need to, if we can get together like this and tackle the mental health, criminal justice intersection and have coalitions around that, then there's got to be a way that we can get together to tackle some of these housing issues that we're running into on a regular basis, because a lot of times these people that are coming into care don't need behavioral health treatment level housing. They just need housing, just simple housing.
I think the challenge varies too from county to county. I mean, there's obviously more resources in some counties than there are others, and there's different resources in different counties. And I think when addressing your question of how do we make sure that people receive the supportive care that they need post-crisis, how do they receive the supports? I know that in Maricopa County, particularly, and I've mentioned this a few times, that the services seem to be there many times, not necessarily all the housing we need. Like I said, if we had all the housing we needed, I think we'd have a lot of our problems solved. But it amazes me how many services are out there and we're just not aware of them. So I began a project not that long ago where I was actually trying to map out the services along the Sequential Intercept model. And I started to go out and I talked to many of you in the room about services that your agency provides, because I wanted to know what kind of work you did. And so in each of these conversations that I would have, I would always get to a point in the conversation where the person would say, "But do you know what the problem is?" Or, "But do you know where the problems lie?" And I said, "No, I don't." And so then they would tell me, and I'd be like, that doesn't seem like it should be a problem, but okay. So I'd leave, and 3 interviews later, I'd be talking to somebody, and they'd say, all of a sudden, they'd be telling me what they do and the services that they provide, and I'd be like, "Hey, you offer the solution to that first agency's problems." But I had no idea that it existed, nor did they know that someone had the problem. And so that communication thing, I think it's easier, and it's not necessarily easier, but it's probably more manageable in a community that has less resources or fewer resources. But it's important to begin mapping those, and I think understanding what resources are out there and available. And the regional behavioral health authorities are wonderful at knowing what's out there, and they're a great resource for all of those things. But it requires us doing some legwork too, and talking to people and finding out what's out there and finding out what other people do. And that's why events like this are so wonderful, I think.
My question is about prevention and kind of the first stages of people, male and females that are coming out of the detention centers, juveniles, and going into the adult jail and adult prison system. Like, what are some programs that might be already set up, or some data, or just different angles of what might be done in those areas?
I don't have a lot of information with this. I know Coconino County for a while had a re-entry program where they had juveniles that were leaving custody that had been incarcerated for an extended period of time. Were receiving, they moved them to a different housing where they were kind of together on the people who were getting out soon after they'd been incarcerated for a long time. And then they were letting them out into the community after they had received some training on how to readjust to the world. That's one of the things, and I know Hope Live comes up to Flagstaff often, and some of their employees, Winter, I don't know if he's in here or not, he'll go to the jail sometimes, because we find that a lot of our individuals that are being released from jail, they get lost on their way to the next appointment, and especially people with substance abuse issues. And so having that warm handoff to take them from the jail systems to the medical system without the chance that they're going to get lost on the way there, it has kind of decreased the recidivism, because they're able to take that next step in the process, and if they can make that first appointment, then they tend to be another step further into the process. I don't know if there's a lot of information. It's a very difficult, challenging system when we're talking about the differences in, especially in the incarceration and the legal system between the juvenile system and the adult system. They're different, and it's there's a lot of one's based on kind of more of a punishment model, which would be the adult system, and the juvenile system is based on a correctional model on trying to change their behavior. And so they approach it from two totally different philosophical methods, and I don't know that there's as much interaction as there should be.
Down in Tucson and in Pima County, our mental health team and the Sheriff's Department mental health team serve on our reentry coalition as well. And I know Simpatico and the county are really involved in that, trying to get people signed up for benefits and enrolled for things before they even actually leave the facility. I was in a meeting recently where our jail commanders were talking about at the Sheriff's Department a system where people could get a state ID, not a driver's license, but just a state ID before they leave. As Dr. Balfour talked about, that's really a cause for concern for a lot of the population that we deal with.
And I was just going to mention briefly with the Forensic Act team, the Transition Age Youth here in Maricopa County, there are numerous programs set up to help them transition. But then when you have someone who's in the juvenile system going into that adult system and they still have some legal standings, the Forensic Act team provides such intensive services to help allow them to transition, number one, into that adult system, but also into the community, and hopefully establishing a lot of support in the community to don't have to be in the criminal justice system.
How many of you deal with people over 65? Okay, so when you are incarcerated, if you turn 65 in prison, you're not allowed to sign up for Social Security. So because it's a federal law, so if you get out at 70, you are penalized for every year that you didn't sign up for Social Security on your Medicare. In other words, you get your Social Security, but your Medicare, you can only get Part A unless you want to pay that big fine. And most inmates, felons, can't do that. There is a system through Social Security to sign up and defer, but that's not happening. So, what can you do about this if you get somebody that's over 65 and SMI and desperately needs Medicare? Are they just going to depend on access, or are they getting, what are they getting?
I'm not familiar with that either. And I guess that my question would be, when you had mentioned the opportunity to defer, and it's not happening, is that something that they have the ability to do, let's say, while they're incarcerated, they can defer and
Yes.
not be penalized? This might be a question that we might want to bring back tomorrow when we have Dr. Taylor on the panel.
I've been asking DOC since 2009 because it happened to someone I know personally. And I just had a friend get out of DOC in March who's 72, and she turned 65 in prison. She's a breast cancer survivor. She's not SMI, she's a breast cancer survivor. She can only get Part A because she can't afford the penalties. I've been talking to DOC about this since 2009, and nothing has happened. Sign up and defer, I only found that out because I Googled it. Sign up and defer, you can do legally, but it's not happening. So this puts people out on the street, and the prison population is aging. I know because I'm old. And what can be done? That's a serious problem.
It's a very serious problem, and I think it's a good question. And I think it's one that we can address, and maybe we can talk about a little bit later, because I'd love to know the answers to that question. I see. I think that's what she's saying, is that they can, yeah, but it's not being done. That's what it sounds like, yeah, and we can talk more about that. Thank you so much for bringing that up. That's great. I think we have time for one more question, and so if there's one more question out there somewhere.
Hi, my name is Sherry Harris. I'm the Chief Prosecutor for the San Carlos Apache Tribe, and we are here to participate and make connections, but I'm just curious as to how many counties are partnering maybe with the tribal entities that are located in your county. And it seems like we're able to listen, but not sure how this applies to us because of the sovereign land issue, also having different funding sources issue, but it's still a problem, and we may not always have access to the same resources. So we're here looking to make the connections and partner with those that are in our counties, so we can, be in on the work and be part of the solution as well, because Arizona does have a large Native American population.
Thank you. I can only speak for the Yavapai Apache Nation tribe that we work with in the Verde Valley, but we do a lot of work to support mobile crisis on the reservation near us, and in fact have several different services embedded in their agencies that are on the reservation, and have entered into a memorandum of understanding to provide those services. And so we now provide our mobile crisis unit, and when I was talking about the 8 law enforcement agencies that we partner with, the tribal police are one of them. And so they now attend our quarterly meetings as well, and we respond in real time to anywhere on the reservation to provide mobile crisis services for them. So we do a lot of work in that regard. I'm not sure about the other areas.
Yeah, and so in Tucson, we mostly deal with the TO, and we meet with them regularly. They utilize our facility just like anyone else. And then I don't want to speak completely for Simpatico and Nursewise, but they run our crisis line, and they have a tribal liaison. And so, they actually have people who answer the phone who are from the tribes who can speak to that. And the mobile teams do respond out there.
And then from the law enforcement perspective, so the training is universal. So the Sheriff's Department down in Pima County and the Police Department down in Tucson, we've been all over the state doing mental health first aid training. Anyone is more than welcome to join one of our CIT trainings. We've been as far as south as Nogales and up to Prescott Valley and everywhere in between doing mental health first aid training. So if there are training needs out there, please connect with us, and we're more than happy to help.
We do the same thing up north. We collaborate a lot, and we've had a lot of law enforcement from BIA and from the Hopi tribe and from the Navajo tribe. Additionally, I know our sheriff's office collaborates very well with the law enforcement entities in that jurisdiction, and it kind of depends because the confusions on the laws and those things on who's involved and what their race is on who's going to respond to that particular moment. So a lot of times the deputies that are in those areas are pretty knowledgeable with the other tribal law enforcement that happens to be there, and will collaborate. The other thing that's important is the role of the TRIBA or the REBA, and sometimes a lot of the reservations have different behavioral health authorities that are over the tribe, and the importance of the collaboration of the TRIBAs with the border towns that their population frequents in the jails that their clients or that they're providing services to may be utilizing is essential so that this person can sustain a continuation of their services when they're home or when they're in the local jail.
Thank you, Corey. I think we're about out of time for this segment, but we'd like to thank each of the panelists for taking the time out of their day away from providing the services that we so greatly need to share their experiences with us. And so if we could give them a round of applause, I'd be grateful.